They had been prepared for hunger, for punishment, and for being made to obey through force, because everything they believed about capture told them that refusal would be met with violence or humiliation. What unsettled them was not the food itself, but the fact that it was placed in front of them without pressure, without threats, and without anyone insisting that they eat. In that moment, a simple choice became deeply confusing because refusing felt dangerous, accepting felt suspicious, and the absence of coercion raised a question none of them were ready to answer about what kind of captivity this really was. The moment food was placed in front of them, it did not register as relief, because relief requires certainty, and certainty was the one thing still missing from their surroundings. Bowls and trays appeared without ceremony, set down quietly, without explanation or command, as if the act itself carried no expectation at all. The prisoners noticed this immediately, not because they were not hungry, but because hunger had always been tied to pressure, and pressure was absent here in a way that felt deliberate. In their experience, food was never neutral, and its sudden neutrality made it difficult to interpret what accepting it might mean. Some of the men stared at what had been given to them without touching it, their attention fixed not on the meal itself, but on the space around it, watching for a reaction that never came. No voice ordered them to eat, no gesture suggested consequence, and no authority figure lingered nearby to observe compliance. This lack of response created a quiet tension, because refusal usually invites correction, and when correction does not arrive, the mind begins to search for the hidden cost. They had been taught that obedience was enforced, and now obedience was optional, which made the choice feel heavier than any command. For many of them, refusing food was not an act of protest, but an act of caution. Accepting it too easily felt like stepping into something they did not understand, a system whose rules had not yet revealed themselves. Hunger was familiar and manageable, but the idea of trust was far more dangerous. If the enemy offered nourishment without demand, then the danger must exist elsewhere, delayed or disguised, and patience became a form of defense. Waiting, in this moment, felt safer than participation. Others struggled internally with the conflict between instinct and belief. The body responded immediately to the presence of food, but the mind resisted, reminding them of everything they had been told about surrender and capture. To eat might mean acknowledging survival as acceptable, and that idea clashed with years of conditioning that framed captivity as dishonor rather than endurance. The refusal, therefore, was not coordinated or spoken aloud, but it spread quietly, one man watching another hesitate, then doing the same, until stillness replaced motion across the space. What made this moment especially unsettling was the reaction of those in control, or rather the absence of one. The guards did not intervene, did not display impatience, and did not record the refusal as an offense that required correction. They moved on to other tasks, leaving the food where it was, as if the decision mattered less than the passage of time. This indifference felt intentional, because it shifted responsibility inward, forcing each prisoner to confront his own choice without guidance. When no one reacts, the burden of meaning falls entirely on the individual. Hours passed, and the situation remained unchanged. Some men eventually ate, slowly and cautiously, while others continued to wait, testing whether consequences would emerge later. The lack of immediate outcome deepened the uncertainty, because systems built on force rarely allow defiance to pass unnoticed. Here, defiance seemed to dissolve into routine, unmarked and unacknowledged, and that quiet absorption made it difficult to understand what kind of authority governed the camp. This moment, simple on the surface, began to alter how captivity was experienced. The refusal to eat revealed that control did not always announce itself through punishment, and that compliance was not always demanded loudly. By offering food without insistence, the environment introduced a different kind of pressure, one that relied on time rather than force, and on internal conflict rather than external threat. The prisoners sensed that this approach required more from them psychologically, because it asked them to decide rather than react. As night approached, hunger remained, but it was no longer the dominant sensation. Confusion had taken its place, accompanied by a growing awareness that the rules of this captivity would not be learned through resistance alone. The food, untouched by some and accepted by others, became a symbol of something larger, a sign that choices existed here in unexpected ways, and that those choices carried weight even when no one seemed to be watching. By the end of that first encounter with refusal, the prisoners understood that this camp would not break them through immediate deprivation. Instead, it would present situations that required interpretation, patience, and internal negotiation, allowing uncertainty to do much of the work. The unanswered refusal lingered in their thoughts, not as a victory or a defeat, but as a question that remained open, quietly shaping how they would approach every interaction that followed. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the days followed that first refusal, hunger became a familiar presence, but familiarity did not make it less complicated. The body adjusted in predictable ways, growing quieter, slower, and more focused on basic sensation, while the mind remained alert, scanning each moment for meaning. Food continued to appear at regular intervals, placed with the same calm indifference as before, never accompanied by threat or insistence. And this consistency created a strange contrast, because it removed the drama they had expected while deepening the uncertainty they could not resolve. Some men began to eat more regularly, not because trust had formed, but because exhaustion demanded compromise. Hunger can be endured for a time, but it eventually narrows attention, making thought itself more difficult, and this physical pressure forced practical decisions. Others continued to resist, less out of conviction than out of habit, because once refusal had become a pattern, changing it felt like surrendering control. In this way, the act of eating or not eating slowly turned into a marker of internal alignment rather than survival alone. What troubled many prisoners was the realization that their choices seemed to carry no immediate consequence. There was no visible reward for compliance and no punishment for refusal, only continuation. This absence of feedback unsettled them more than discipline would have, because discipline confirms the boundaries of power, while silence obscures them. When authority does not respond, it becomes difficult to know whether one has acted wisely or foolishly, and doubt begins to replace certainty as the primary emotional state. Hunger also altered perception. Small details became more noticeable, such as the sound of utensils, the movement of others eating nearby, and the way time seemed to stretch between meals. These observations were not merely sensory, but interpretive, as each man tried to understand what the environment was asking of him. Was patience being tested, or was endurance being measured, or was the system simply indifferent to individual struggle? Without answers, the mind worked continuously, filling silence with speculation. Trust, they realized, was far more difficult to manage than hunger. Hunger follows a pattern that the body understands, rising and falling in predictable ways, but trust requires belief in intention, and intention remained unclear. Accepting food could be seen as an admission that survival was permitted, but survival without clarity felt dangerous. Refusing food could be seen as resistance, but resistance without response felt hollow. Each choice existed in isolation, unsupported by confirmation from the outside world. Over time, the group dynamic shifted subtly. Men observed one another closely, not to enforce behavior, but to interpret it. Who continued to refuse, who began to eat, who hesitated, and who acted without visible concern. All of these patterns were noticed and quietly categorized. These observations created an unspoken social map, where behavior became a way to signal internal state rather than allegiance. The camp did not require conformity, but uncertainty encouraged comparison, and comparison shaped perception. The guards, for their part, remained consistent. Their routines did not change in response to the prisoners' choices, reinforcing the impression that the system operated independently of individual action. This neutrality felt deliberate, as if the environment were designed to absorb behavior without reacting to it. By refusing to intervene, authority shifted responsibility inward, leaving each prisoner alone with the consequences of his own interpretation. In such a setting, the absence of force became a form of pressure because it removed the clarity that force provides. As hunger persisted, its emotional weight began to change. It no longer felt like a test imposed from outside, but like a condition chosen repeatedly, day after day. This reframing altered how the prisoners understood their own endurance, because enduring hunger by choice requires different justification than enduring it under compulsion. The mind had to explain its own behavior, and those explanations were not always satisfying. Some found meaning in restraint, others in adaptation, and still others in quiet resignation. By the end of this phase, the refusal to eat had lost its sharpness, but it had not lost its significance. What remained was a lingering sense that captivity here demanded something more subtle than obedience or defiance. It demanded continuous interpretation, constant internal negotiation, and the ability to exist without clear signals. Hunger had been easier to understand, easier to endure, and easier to justify. Trust, however, remained unresolved, hovering quietly over every meal, every choice, and every moment of waiting that followed. The camp settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary from a distance. Yet inside that rhythm, there were quiet fractures that only showed themselves when you watched closely. Morning counts, tool checks, work details, the familiar lines that formed and dissolved with the same predictable motion. It looked like a system that could run forever, and for the American staff, predictability was safety. If a camp stayed predictable, it stayed manageable, and if it stayed manageable, it stayed calm. But the refusal to eat did not fit inside any predictable schedule. It did not explode like a riot, and it did not announce itself with threats. It simply appeared, like a light going out in a building that had been lit the day before, and once it appeared, it changed the meaning of every small routine. At first, the Americans read the situation through their own habits. If men refused food, it meant protest or fear or an attempt to bargain. In many places, hunger was used as leverage, the kind of leverage that demanded a response because it came with a deadline. Bodies weakened, and weakened bodies forced quick decisions. Yet in this camp, the refusal did not arrive as a demand. It arrived as a statement, and it was that difference that confused the guards most. The prisoners did not stand at the fence and shout. They did not wave bowls in the air. They did not ask for anything specific. They simply allowed the trays to come and then allowed them to leave. A meal became something that passed through the room untouched, and the silence around it carried more weight than any speech. The cooks hated it first. In a place built on numbers, food was one of the few human duties that still felt like care. Bread was cut, rice was measured, soup was stirred, and in those actions there was a small claim that the day could still be normal. When the trays returned nearly full, it felt like an insult to the hands that prepared them. but it also felt like a warning that the camp was entering a new kind of trouble. The camp doctors watched with a different kind of attention. Hunger was not a theory to them. Hunger had stages, and each stage brought its own risks. And in those risks, there were decisions that had to be made. They examined posture, breathing, skin tone, eyes that stayed open a little too long, and the slow fading of energy that made walking look heavier than it should. They asked the guards for careful reports, not because they suspected violence, but because they needed to know how fast the line was moving toward collapse. And still, no one forced them. That was the part that made everything feel unstable. In other prisons, in other wars, control meant compliance. If a prisoner refused, the system pushed back, and the pushing back reminded everyone who owned the day. Here, the camp was bound by rules that were both practical and political. The United States wanted order, but it also wanted legitimacy. It wanted camps that could be defended in reports and inspected without embarrassment. It wanted to prove to itself and to the world that captivity did not require cruelty. So the American response became its own kind of waiting. They recorded names. They counted calories that were not eaten. They kept the schedules unchanged, as if the unchanged schedules might persuade the prisoners back into eating. They watched, and their watching became a pressure of its own, because being watched while you refuse something basic is like refusing it twice. Inside the barracks, hunger did not look heroic. It looked slow. It looked ordinary. Men sat longer on their bunks. Hands rested on knees without purpose. A room that used to carry the restless sound of movement began to soften, as if the air itself had grown heavy. The refusal to eat stripped the day of its sharp edges. It did not create drama. It created an emptiness, and emptiness is harder to punish because it does not give you a clear target. Some prisoners treated the refusal like discipline, not like emotion. Their faces stayed set, their eyes steady, their posture controlled. They were not trying to win an argument with Americans, because an argument would imply that Americans were the main audience. Instead, the message seemed aimed inward. It was as if the act of refusing food was a way to reclaim something that captivity had taken, a way to prove that even in a fenced world there remained one decision that could not be scheduled by a guard. Yet not everyone could hold it the same way. Hunger made some men quieter, but it made others restless. Small irritations grew larger. A miscount in a line, a misplaced blanket, a look held too long, and suddenly the room felt charged. Not with violence, but with a brittle tension, the kind that forms when everyone is trying to hold themselves together and has fewer resources left for patience. The guards noticed another change as well, one that had nothing to do with anger. The prisoner's eyes began to carry a distant focus, as if they were looking past the walls and past the present day. When you stop eating, you do not only lose strength. You lose time. Minutes stretch. Sounds become sharper. Thoughts circle back to the same places. Hunger turns the mind into a narrow hallway where the same footsteps repeat. For the Americans, this was deeply unsettling because it suggested that the prisoners had found a way to turn suffering into control. The camp could provide beds, medical care, and predictable routines. It could even provide better food than many men had seen in the final months of the war. But it could not make a man accept comfort if he chose to treat comfort as surrender. And still, no one forced them, because forcing them would have meant breaking the camp's identity and perhaps breaking the narrative the United States needed to maintain. So the standoff continued, not as a battle of fists, but as a battle of meaning. The food was there. The refusal was there. The guard stood between those two facts, waiting for something to change. And in that waiting, the camp began to understand that hunger was not simply absence. Hunger was language, and it was being spoken quietly day after day in a place built to silence every message that did not come through official channels. By the time the Americans realized this, the refusal had already done its work. It had rearranged the atmosphere. It had made every meal a question rather than a routine. It had made the act of offering food feel less like control and more like uncertainty. And in a prison, uncertainty spreads faster than fear, because fear can be managed, but uncertainty infects the system itself. In the soft hours before lights out, when the camp quieted and the fences seemed to dissolve into the darkness, the men who refused to eat lay awake with a strange calm. The stomach ached, the body weakened, but the mind held onto one sharp truth. They were still capable of choosing a refusal, and in that refusal they felt, for a moment, like prisoners who had found a small way to stop the world from moving them without consent. By the fourth phase of their confinement, the refusal to eat no longer felt like a reaction to the camp itself, but like a condition that had settled inside the men who practiced it. Hunger was no longer sharp or dramatic, and it no longer announced itself loudly in the body. Instead, it became dull, steady, and strangely manageable, like a background noise that never fully disappeared but no longer demanded immediate attention. This change was unsettling because it suggested that the body could adapt to absence, and adaptation carried with it the risk of forgetting what fullness had once felt like. Inside the barracks, time slowed further. Days no longer separated themselves clearly from one another, and meals, once markers that divided the day into understandable segments, lost their meaning. When food was refused repeatedly, the day became a long, uninterrupted stretch, broken only by counts, quiet movement, and the slow shifting of light across wooden walls. In this environment, the refusal began to shape perception itself, making the present feel endless and the future difficult to imagine in concrete terms. What surprised many of the prisoners was how little discussion the refusal required. There were no speeches, no collective decisions, and no formal agreements. Men simply observed one another and adjusted their behavior accordingly. If someone who had refused began to eat again, it was noticed but rarely commented on. If someone continued to refuse longer than expected, it was also noticed but met with silence. Judgment, when it existed, remained internal, because speaking it aloud would have required clarity that no one truly possessed. The absence of external enforcement gradually shifted pressure inward. Without punishment to resist, each man was forced to confront his own motivations repeatedly. Was the refusal still a statement, or had it become habit? Was it preserving dignity, or was it slowly eroding strength without purpose? These questions did not demand answers immediately, but they lingered, resurfacing during long periods of inactivity, when the mind had little else to occupy it. The camp authorities continued to watch, but by now their attention had become routine rather than urgent. Medical checks were conducted quietly, and records were updated without ceremony. There was no escalation, no dramatic intervention, and no visible attempt to break the pattern. This consistency reinforced the sense that the system was not reacting, but enduring, and endurance on the part of authority can feel more intimidating than force, because it suggests that time itself is on the side of control. Among the prisoners, physical weakness began to alter social dynamics in subtle ways. Movement slowed, conversation shortened, and long silences became more common. Energy that might once have fueled frustration or defiance was redirected towards simple maintenance, standing, walking, remaining alert enough to respond when required. In this state, refusal lost its emotional charge and became procedural, something that happened because it had happened the day before. Some men began to experience moments of doubt that fell sharper than hunger itself. They questioned whether the refusal was still meaningful if it no longer provoked a response. and whether continuing it served any purpose beyond maintaining a sense of continuity with the past. Yet abandoning it felt equally difficult, because it would require acknowledging that the choice had reached its limit, and admitting that limit could feel like defeat even in the absence of an opponent. The most profound change occurred internally. The refusal began to redefine how the prisoners understood control. They realized that while they could not influence the structure of the camp, they could influence how they responded to it. And that influence, however small, carried psychological weight. At the same time, they sensed that clinging to refusal indefinitely might slowly reduce them to observers of their own decline, trapped in a pattern that no longer reflected intention. By this stage, hunger was no longer the central experience. Instead, the defining sensation was a quiet tension between persistence and surrender, between holding on and letting go. The refusal had stripped captivity of its obvious confrontations and replaced them with internal negotiations that never fully resolved. Each day required the same question to be asked again, not aloud, but privately, and the absence of an answer became part of the routine. As the weeks progressed, it became clear that the camp would not force a conclusion. The system was content to let time do its work, trusting that endurance, rather than confrontation, would eventually reshape behavior. For the prisoners, this realization carried a heavy implication, which was that the refusal, once a clear gesture, had become a mirror, reflecting back their own uncertainty rather than imposing itself on the world around them. In this way, the refusal to eat reached its quietest and most difficult stage. It was no longer about food, authority, or even resistance in any traditional sense. It was about the slow erosion of certainty and the uncomfortable understanding that when no one forces a choice, the burden of meaning rests entirely on the person who must continue making it. By the fifth stage of this quiet refusal, the question was no longer whether the men would eat, but how the body would eventually resolve what the mind could not. Hunger had ceased to feel like a choice in the way it once had, because choice requires clarity, and clarity had been worn thin by repetition. What remained was a slow negotiation between physical need and mental habit, played out without witnesses, without commentary, and without any moment that could be clearly identified as a turning point. Some men began to eat again without acknowledging the change, lifting a utensil as if it had always been part of the day, as if nothing had shifted inside them. There was no announcement, no apology, and no explanation offered to anyone else, because explanations would have required a story that no longer felt complete. The act of eating returned quietly, stripped of symbolism, no longer resistance and no longer acceptance, but simply a response to the body's insistence that it could not remain suspended indefinitely. Others continued to refuse longer, not out of conviction, but out of inertia. When a pattern lasts long enough, it becomes difficult to abandon, even when its original meaning has faded. For these men, eating again felt less like relief and more like interruption, a break in continuity that required effort they no longer possessed. Hunger, by contrast, had become familiar, predictable, and strangely contained, and familiarity can feel safer than change when everything else has already shifted beyond recognition. Inside the barracks, these differences were observed but rarely discussed. The camp had entered a phase where overt judgment felt unnecessary, because each man appeared to be carrying his own burden privately. Those who ate did not encourage others to follow, and those who refused did not attempt to persuade anyone to remain with them. Silence became the common language, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it would have required certainty, and certainty no longer belonged to anyone. The camp authorities noticed the change as well, though they treated it as confirmation rather than resolution. The return of eating did not bring celebration, nor did continued refusal provoke alarm. Records were updated, routines remained unchanged, and the system absorbed both behaviors without comment. In this way, the camp reinforced a message it had been sending from the beginning, which was that it would not force a conclusion, and that time, rather than intervention, would shape outcomes. As the days passed, the physical effects of hunger became less uniform. Some bodies recovered quickly, responding to nourishment with renewed strength, while others remained slow and fragile, as if the refusal had left an imprint that could not be erased immediately. These differences reminded the man that even shared experiences unfold unevenly, and that captivity, despite its uniform appearance, was being lived in deeply individual ways. More significant than physical recovery was the subtle shift in how the prisoners understood themselves. The refusal to eat had begun as a response to uncertainty, but it ended as an education in limitation. They learned that control, when exercised only inwardly, has boundaries, and that endurance, when stretched too far, can hollow out intention. This realization did not arrive suddenly, but accumulated quietly, one unremarkable day at a time, until it settled into awareness without demanding acknowledgement. What lingered most strongly was not hunger, but the memory of waiting. Waiting without instruction, waiting without consequence, waiting without a clear purpose beyond persistence itself. That waiting reshaped their sense of time, making the future feel less like a destination and more like a continuation of the present. Plans, once imagined, grew faint, not because hope had vanished, but because imagining outcomes required a stability that no longer existed. By this point, the refusal no longer felt like an act that defined them. It had become one episode among many, absorbed into the broader experience of captivity, where days blended together and meaning was negotiated quietly rather than declared. The men who ate again did not feel that they had lost something essential, and the men who continued to refuse did not feel that they had preserved it. Instead, both groups shared a growing understanding that the most difficult part of this confinement was not deprivation, but the absence of clear signals about what any action truly meant. As the camp continued to function, steady and unreactive, the men adjusted in small, almost invisible ways. They learned to live with unresolved questions, to move through routines without expecting answers, and to carry decisions lightly, knowing that certainty was no longer guaranteed. In this environment, survival did not depend on winning or resisting, but on adapting to ambiguity without allowing it to erode the self entirely. In the end, the body chose when the mind could not, and that choice arrived without ceremony. The refusal faded, not because it was defeated, but because it had completed its quiet work, revealing the limits of inward resistance and the weight of time as a force that does not argue. What remained was not triumph or failure, but a subdued acceptance that some battles do not end with conclusions, only with gradual shifts that leave no clear moment to remember, and no single decision to point to as the reason everything changed. In the end, there was no clear moment that marked the conclusion of the refusal, because endings in this place did not arrive with signals or explanations. The food continued to appear, the routines remained intact, and the days moved forward without acknowledging what had quietly passed. What lingered was not the memory of hunger itself, but the memory of having waited, of having held a choice long enough to discover its limits. For the men who lived through it, the refusal did not define who they were, nor did its end provide relief in any dramatic sense. It simply became part of the larger experience of captivity, absorbed into the slow rhythm of time that shaped everything else. The camp did not demand resolution, and in that absence, the men learned that survival sometimes means allowing questions to remain unanswered. When they eventually looked back on those days, they did not remember the meals as much as the silence around them. They remembered how uncertainty could stretch a moment until it felt endless, and how the absence of force could be as powerful as its presence. In that quiet space between choice and necessity, something shifted inside them, not suddenly, but gently, leaving behind a subdued understanding that endurance does not always announce itself, and that some of the most difficult struggles are the ones that pass without leaving visible marks. And so the story settles, not with resolution, but with continuity, as life inside the camp continued much as it always had, steady and indifferent, while the meaning of what had occurred remained with the men themselves, carried forward silently into whatever came next. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.